often get asked, what are the most important things to know before you start a podcast? So today I'm sharing with you the 7 things that you need to know before you start a podcast. So let's get right to it. Hey y'all, Krystal here, and I'm excited to introduce you to this 3-part podcasting one-on-one series. In this series, we're going to cover exactly how you can start, launch, and market your podcast. I'm so excited to get through this podcasting journey with you. So after you watch this video, be sure to check out the other videos that have to do with launching a podcast and marketing a podcast. But today, we're talking about starting a podcast. So let's dive in. There are 7 things that you need to know about starting a podcast. So the first thing we're going to cover today is equipment. This is always the first question I get from brand new podcasters or people just wanting to get started. What equipment do I need? It's very simple, very basic. All you need is a USB microphone. This is actually the microphone I started off with. It was $21 on Amazon. It has a little USB cord. It actually has a really long cord too. So if you're kind of like, cramped on space, but you want to, be close enough to the computer, far enough away from the mic, like all those things. It has a very long cord. And I just recommend you get something that works for your budget. Please don't feel like you have to go out and spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on podcasting equipment. I got started for less than $30. This is actually the mic that I used for the first 38 episodes of my podcast. So if it can work for me, it can work for you. And even after then, I upgraded to a Blue Yeti, which is the microphone that I use today, and it was still around $100. So you don't have to spend a ton of money in order to get started with your podcast. The next thing I want to talk about, number 2, is your podcast title and your tagline. Now, there are a few ways to go about this, but I want to make something very clear. When it comes to your podcast title, you want to be as clear as possible. This isn't the time to come up with some super cutesy names or confusing titles that are going to leave potential listeners going, what is this about? So I love the book, Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. And in there, he keeps saying over and over and over again, if you confuse, you lose. I'm going to say that again. If you confuse, you lose. So I want to make sure that you are doing everything that you can to make sure that your podcast title is as clear as possible. And maybe you've come up with a few titles that you're playing with and you're like, these are just way too long. Then my suggestion is to come up with a simple podcast title and a killer tagline to back up what your podcast is about. So for example, I have a podcast called The Proffitt Podcast. Maybe it's not clear to you exactly what this podcast is about, which is why I support it with an awesome tagline, where entrepreneurs go to learn how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I keep it super simple. It's very clear that my podcast is about entrepreneurs learning to start, launch, and market their podcast. So keep it very simple, keep it very clear, and then remember, if you confuse, you lose. Podcasting 101 step number 3 is content planning and scheduling. I cannot stress to you how important content planning is. For one, you want to make sure that you are finding relevant topics and content ideas that your audience is already they're waiting to hear what you have to say. They are coming to you as the expert in your industry or to be entertained by you, but you kind of want to give the audience what they're looking for. So make sure that you constantly have a running list of ideas for podcast topics that you can talk about, industry experts that you can interview, and schedule it out on your calendar. This is so important there's 2 reasons why this is so important. Okay, the first is I don't want you sitting there week after week saying, I have no idea what I'm going to talk about this week. I don't ever want that to happen to you. This happened to me so much at the beginning of my podcast, and it's super frustrating. It's a waste of time, and you just feel like you're spinning your wheels. So I want you to really have a plan for the content you're going to put out for your podcast. The second reason I want you to plan your content and schedule it out is it helps you stay consistent. And consistency is like the foundational principle behind having a successful podcast. It goes back to, I don't want you spinning your wheels, but I also want you to sit down week after week and say, yes, I have more content ideas. I know what I'm doing a month from now, or I know what I'm doing in 2 weeks, because that gives you the momentum to keep going. It's going to help you keep producing amazing, amazing content. So make sure that you're planning your content ahead of time and you're scheduling it out. Notice, I didn't say anything about creating a ton of content at one time. I'm talking about just getting some ideas on paper or in your Google Docs or in the Notes app on your phone, wherever you're putting these ideas, but make sure that you're constantly planning content and scheduling it out on your editorial calendar for your podcast. Another thing I wanted to mention is whenever you know what's coming up ahead, you know that there's a few podcasts that you've already done, or there's some things that you kind of have in the works, you're able to tease that out to your audience. It gets them excited about it. Therefore, it gets you excited about it because you can't wait to create this content for your audience. So content planning and scheduling is so important to helping your podcast get off on the right foot. So I'm really curious, is this the first time you've ever heard the mention of content planning or scheduling things out ahead of time? Have you always just kind of winged it? Like, comment below and let me know. Or is this the first time you've ever even thought about creating any kind of content to be put out into the world? Because I'm generally curious as to how this podcasting one-on-one series can help you, and I want to know what your questions are when it comes to content planning and scheduling. Okay, let's get back to the other things that we're covering today. The fourth step in starting a podcast is show format. Now, I did an entire video right here about setting up your show format. So I want you to go check that out after this video is over. But basically the gist of it is you want to set up your podcast format as a beginning, a middle, and an end. I want you to think about it like basic storytelling. What did you learn in your elementary school where it was like your teacher is standing up at the front saying, okay, you need to have an introduction, the body or the main story of the paper, and then I want you to have the conclusion. It is the same thing with a podcast. You want to make sure that you have a format. Yes, things are going to be different from podcast to podcast, and you're going to have ads, or you're going to have music, or you're going to have, all kinds of other things, but I want you just to understand the basic principles of a podcast show format. Okay, the fifth step in starting a podcast, and it's kind of funny because this is in step number 5, but now we're going to talk about the good stuff. Software and recording. Can you believe that? Like, we've gone through all these steps and we're just now getting to the software. It's because the planning and really understanding the principal foundations of why you're doing this podcast are going to help get you through the kind of overwhelm that can come with software and recording, because maybe you're already cringing up a little bit like, oh, this is the part that scares me. I don't know how to do this technology stuff, or I don't know how to learn this new program. Calm down. I promise it's going to be okay, because if I can figure this out, I know that you can too. So I use the free software Audacity, and you're in luck because I actually have a tutorial video right here that's going to cover the basics of Audacity, how to use it, how to edit, and just cover some of the basics that you need to know for the podcasting one-on-one series. But I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. I hear this all the time from my students and my clients. They're like, I don't know how to do this. It's too much. Let me explain it to you this way. You didn't know how to use Microsoft Word until you started using it. You learned it. You didn't know how to use PowerPoint. I bet you didn't even know how to use Facebook until you got in there and started playing around. It is the exact same thing with any podcasting software. So give yourself some grace and just know there's going to be a learning curve. Make sure you check out the Audacity editing video. If you have any questions, put them below this video or below that video and ask me. Like, You'll never get answers to your questions if you don't ask. So make sure that you understand your podcast software and how to use it. So the sixth thing that I want to talk about are solo podcast episodes and interviews, because Podcasting 101 would not be complete without us talking about how do you record a solo episode and how in the world do you set up a podcast interview. So I don't have time to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but I want you to check out these two videos right here because I've shown you exactly what it takes to record a solo podcast episode and set up a podcast interview. So I'm just going to recommend you go check out those videos because I want your podcast to be successful and I want you to check out the details that are in those videos. But at the end of the day, the most important thing I want you to remember is give yourself grace and always make sure that you're adding tons of value to your audience and to your podcast. Okay, stay with me here because we are in the final step of starting a podcast for this Podcasting 101 series. And the last thing I want to talk about is podcast artwork and your music. So we have a few options here when it comes to your podcast artwork. You can go create your own logo for free at canva.com. It's as simple as going to canva.com, typing in the search bar logo, and then creating something using one of their free templates. But if you don't feel creative or you feel like that's too much or you don't have time, then I recommend that you hire this out to a professional graphic designer or someone who has a great sense of what it takes for a great podcast logo, podcast artwork. But there are a few things to consider whether you do this yourself or you hire this out. I want you to remember to make sure your logo looks great, really small or really big, because it makes all the difference. People are going to be listening to your podcast, maybe on a desktop computer or on their mobile device. So you want to make sure that you're meeting the requirements for the platforms where your podcast is going to show up. I'm actually going to link below this video to some of the podcast dimensions that you need for your artwork and what you need to consider whenever you're creating the resolution and the dimensions. And if I'm making your brain explode a little bit, then maybe you should consider hiring this out to a graphic designer. But if you're still here with me, then I think that you should create your own logo. Get creative with it. Have fun with it. But another thing I want to make sure that you do is not put too much text on your logo. Please do not do this, because if you jam it up and people cannot read, again, going back to the you confuse, you lose, I don't want that to happen for your podcast. So make sure your artwork is legible and creative, because if they can't read, you ain't gonna succeed. And finally, music. So here are my thoughts on podcast music. It's 100% optional. I know podcasts that I love to listen to every single week and they have zero, I'm talking about no music whatsoever. So don't feel like you have to go out and spend hundreds of dollars or go to find like the perfect sound for your podcast, because it's totally optional. You don't even have to include it at all in your podcast. But if you are, here are some things to consider. I think podcast music is a great way to bring a cool vibe to your tribe. Y'all like this? Like, I'm on fire with this poetry today. But if you want to add music to your podcast, there are two options. One, you can purchase royalty-free music online. There are lots of reputable places out there, but you want to make sure that you read the fine print when it comes to using music. Maybe there are stipulations that say, well, you can use it this way, but you can't use it this way. So I want to make sure that you aren't breaking any laws and you aren't stepping on anybody's toes by using someone else's music in a way that it wasn't intended for. So make sure you always read the fine print. And the second way that you can acquire music for your podcast is to hire it out. I've personally done this for my podcast. I hired someone from Fiverr.com to produce some music for me. And I was so thrilled to have this as an option because I have custom music for my podcast. But again, make sure that you read the fine print on any freelancing websites or even through a customer agreement that you have with the music producer, because they may have some of these same stipulations. You can use it this way, but not that way. Or maybe you have to give them credit every single time you use it. So make sure that you understand this before you ever get into an agreement that you can't get out of. And those are the 7 steps in this Podcasting 101 series. So make sure you check out how to launch a podcast and how to market a podcast, because those are going to be crucial to the foundation of your podcast. So give us a thumbs up if you liked this video and you found it helpful. Make sure that you come back every single Friday as we put out brand new podcasting videos, and make sure that you sign up for the free 5-day Create Your Podcast Bootcamp. If you love this Podcasting 101 series, then I go even deeper into everything we covered today. Plus, I'm going to tell you some more of the resources and strategies that you won't find anywhere else. So remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.